to his boss, and the boss said, "You two are like, oil and water. We're not worried about you." And he said that was true.
And it is true. Yes, I know both. Yes.
And it was true. And yet, over the time that they were working together, Tim fell in love with Debbie. And you can see why, because she had a warm heart. And, she really never met a stranger. He said that was one of the reasons why he didn't like traveling with her, because in airports, he'd be getting care of the luggage and she would be chatting somebody about the Lord and sharing her faith and spending long time in conversations. And that was her. If you're talking to her, you are the only person in that room.
Yes.
And she's focused and she remembers, her mind just remembered details about people. And there's just a lot of love and grace, even for her enemies. And that's how I sort of put it in my tribute to her, which was my commentary, because she is an example, or was an example, of how you really do politics. Back in the 90s, she was a mom of 3, and her kids are about the same ages as mine, and I met her through some activism I was doing, and she kind of drew me in. And she found out that the best way to get things done in politics in Texas, and really probably everywhere at that time, was to have a Republican women's club that would get people elected, the people that you wanted. Well, being a pro-life, pro-family, homeschooling mom, she kind of got a few friends together and started the Golden Corridor Republican Women's Club.
Amazing, yeah.
And that was, of course, the early 90s, and we were seeing some pretty radical ideas out there. We saw the Clinton presidency. We saw Hillary Care. We saw a lot of changes in the military that were happening because of the LGBT agenda, and just so many issues that motivated people. This club became the fastest growing Republican women's club in the state of Texas. It's still a powerhouse club. And it was because of, I think, really because of Debbie. She just brought people in from all over the place. They weren't necessarily hyper conservative like we are, but there was a lot of teaching going on and a lot of great people coming in to teach us. And so anyway, that was Debbie. And I couldn't believe about a year and a half ago when she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she she wanted to make sure everybody felt okay about it. She didn't want people being upset, but she really tried hard to go a real natural route of therapy, and ended up, it was a very, very aggressive cancer, and actually took her fairly quickly. And it was a shock to me. It was really a shock because I didn't communicate with her for a couple of months just for busyness sake. And then, it was just, the end was coming soon. And I am going to miss her. I had lots of touch points over the years with her. Our kids were at Baylor together, for instance. Our husbands liked each other, and she's gone. But she was a great example of how you, with grace, fight important battles and don't give up. And when I walked into the service, I was just amazed to see who was there. There was really a who's who of Texas conservative politics. She had 4 eulogies. One was Ken Paxton. One was Sherry Bell, who helped her in the Republican Women's Club and talked about what a friend she was. One was her son, Ben. And the final one was Tommy Nelson, the pastor of Denton Bible Church, who Debbie was a great friend with. Yes. So, I just want to say thank you, Debbie, for what you did in so many of our lives and here in the state of Texas.
And if you'd like to read that, it is on the website right now. As we say, you can obviously receive my commentary Monday through Friday automatically in your inbox, and Penna's will come on Saturday. But if you'd like to find it right now, it's there. It's also got a picture of Debbie Terry. And just before we take a break, I was just thinking the connections she had with this ministry. The first time I ever met Debbie Terry was in the old studio where Marlon Maddox had made his studio every once in a while available, because in the old construction, there was a big open area. And so if you wanted to have a meeting, you could. And so I had a chance when Marlon was calling together all sorts of conservative leaders to meet her. And since, of course, she was in Campus Crusade for Christ, so was my wife. She connected up with Josh McDowell, and of course, I'd just been working with Josh McDowell. Of course, we're all in politics, so there were just a lot of connections. So actually, the first time I met her was something that Marlon Maddox, the host of Point of View, had put together. And the last time I saw her, Angela Paxton and I were reflecting on that yesterday, was when I was the MC for this latest event with Jonathan Saenz, who's on the program with us all the time. And she was there and made a big deal about the fact that Suzanne hasn't changed much over the years. What are you doing? That I want to know how that works.
Well, she was right about that.
Yeah, and so it was kind of fun to see that. But a good friend, and when we come back, we might even pick out a story or two, or at least an illustration, because if nothing else, Debbie illustrates a point that you and I have made so many times. When people say, what should I do? Pronoun problems. What should we do? Mm-hmm. And through Concerned Women for America, where you were involved, the Golden Corridor Women, and a variety of others, if you are frustrated with what's happening in America today, what's happening in the state of Texas today, get involved in a group, because you have the greatest amount of impact that way. So we're going to take a break and do that. Let me just mention real quickly, if you're joining us, that Penna Dexter is, of course, with me. It's our weekend edition. We're going to look at all sorts of issues. A couple of articles I've posted, campaign promises, and that is one that I thought was kind of interesting, and it parallels one that we posted the other day, or I actually mentioned the other day, by Karl Rove, Democrats' Big Ideas May Re-elect Trump. Then the debates were a panderfest, and that was interesting, coming from somebody who was one of the pollsters for the Clintons, but he wasn't all that convinced. And then we also posted one on Baltimore by Tucker Carlson. I think we're going to post also the one you mentioned by Cal Thomas. And we have a lot to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
For the last few decades, politicians and high-tech companies have been talking about the digital divide. They wanted to make sure that poor and underprivileged students have access to the same digital devices as wealthier ones. I've always felt that there was a bigger issue that fewer people were talking about. Fortunately, Naomi Schaefer Riley addresses this in her New York Times op-ed on America's Real Digital Divide. She warns that if you think middle-class children are being harmed by too much screen time, just consider how much greater the damage is to minority and disadvantaged kids who spend much more time in front of screens. One study, for example, found that minority children watch 50% more TV than their white peers. They use computers for up to 1.5 hours longer each day, and the amount of time Black and Hispanic children spend in front of any screen is substantially longer each day than for white children. Another study found that every additional hour of TV increased a child's odds of attention problems by about 10%. Kids who watched 3 hours a day were 30% more likely to have attention problems than those who watched none. The push from politicians and educators has been to bridge the digital divide and get computers and other technology into the classrooms. Apparently, minority students already have access to technology. One Pew Research report documents that African American teenagers are more likely to own a smartphone than any other group of teenagers in America. Put simply, the problem today is not a lack of technology in the schools, in the homes, in the hands of young people. The problem is too much technology. They're spending a significant number of hours each day in front of a TV screen, a video game screen, a computer screen, and a smartphone screen. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter in studio. And again, don't forget her Viewpoints commentary today is one that you might want to follow. And just before we get into the Democrat debates in Baltimore and all the issues, I just thought for a minute, there is a lesson from Debbie Terry, and that is, first of all, as I've said before, the power of one. I mean, she was just a force of nature. Mm-hmm. Single-handedly, sometimes she could pull things off. But the bigger issue for all of us is, if you are frustrated, join a group. Trying to do all of this on your own is not going to be as effective. And you've been a regional director for Concerned Women for America. You've been going to national events all the time, and you recognize that there's a power in numbers, isn't there?
There is. And, I'm thinking back in the 90s, it was a little different because we didn't have email and social media to get the word out on things. Mm-hmm. And so it was more important to meet together. And Christians, we'd meet, we'd inform, and then we'd pray together. And then we'd figure out the actions that were going to be taken. And so, but there was a lot of telephone calling and, that type of thing.
Remember the phone tree you used to use?
We had this automatic phone tree. It seems so rudimentary now that we would get a message on there and it would call people automatically. But we have other ways now. We don't need to meet face to face the way we did. But Debbie is a great example of how still that time together, that face time together, is really the best way of convincing people and loving people. And she always had this combination of love and, getting down to business. And I think that was a rare combination because some of us, if we're a leader in a group and we want to get a certain thing done, you see people as tools. And with her, you never felt like that.
That's good. And
I think that is why she was so successful. And that is something that I hope doesn't, die with her, because people need to understand that love factor is the most important part of it all. And, and then in eternity, as believers, the rest of it fades away.
Yes.
And what we have then is that we're all part of the body of Christ.
Well, again, just a great testimony. It is on our website, Viewpoints. And if nothing else, Marlon Maddox used to say that one of the most dangerous people in America is a woman with a fax machine. Mm-hmm. Now we just updated a woman with email because that is the case. But still, getting together and learning from one another. And if I think about all the great speakers you had at Concerned Women for America, all the great speakers you had at the Golden Corridor, I mean, it really was kind of politics 101, and you would have some individuals that would say, I've never really got involved politically, and then they hear some story, or they recognize that writing a letter to the legislature or going to Washington, D.C. once a year and lobbying a legislator isn't that difficult and could make a difference.
Yeah, because you speak for so many people. So many people are apathetic. Mm-hmm. So if someone actually cares enough to write a letter or whatever, that person represents a lot of other people, and that's how legislators see it.
Well, let's see if we can get into a couple of issues. One of our first articles here is by Scott Rasmussen, Extravagant Candidate Promises. Now, on Wednesday, I had Gary Bauer on a little bit to talk about some of those promises, and yesterday I had Dr. Merrill Matthews especially try to analyze the health care claims and the Green New Deal claims. But this particular article, first one here by Scott Rasmussen, is certainly powerful. And just the other day, we also had this one from Karl Rove saying Democrats' big ideas may re-elect Trump. And you've probably had a chance to see a little bit of the debates and reflect on it. So I'd love to get your thoughts.
I did. And, watching the debates, it was amazing. I think a lot of people have said, well, Elizabeth Warren really won both nights, even though she wasn't there both nights, because, she's just so powerful in the way that she explains her positions. But first of all, to do that, you have to talk our country down. And, right now, the economic success that we have, the good economy and all of that, it has to be either gotten around or explained away. So that's one. But the second part of it is each one of these pieces and many of them are in her plans, but also the ones others are proposing, are costing money, and they're very expensive. And, you just wonder. And then there's, well, how are you going to pay for it? That question is asked every once in a while. Not often enough.
No, not enough, yes.
But, it's we're going to have a wealth tax. We're going to have a financial transaction tax. And so I thought it was interesting that Jay Tapper, at the very beginning of the first night, he really forced the issue that, will this go down to the middle class paying for Medicare for all? Are you going to ask people to get rid of their insurance policy and then be taxed for this Medicare for all plan? And so that was at least a realistic, I thought, question. I didn't think the debates were realistic because there was too much promised.
Yes.
And not enough. How do you pay for it?
2 points. Number one, let me pick up the one that you just mentioned a minute ago. I was pleasantly surprised by some of the questions that came from CNN compared to the questions that came from MSNBC. When you're $22 trillion in debt, and then you are proposing massive spending programs, and I ran through some of those just the other day in terms of just the incredible cost, or as Jim Garrity said, the biggest enemy to Warren and Sanders was math. Paying for it is certainly the case. And then back to your other point, which was really important. In the next hour, we'll talk about a record 157 million employed in July. Okay, this is a record number of people that are employed. And so a lot of people are saying, well, I've got a job. I mean, I know we still have people out on the streets that are homeless, but we've always seemed to have people out on the streets homeless. We have some people that are uninsured, and I thought the Affordable Care Act was supposed to take care of that. And the other one that I've used before is, guess what? When you go against corporations, as Dr. Merrill Matthews pointed out a couple of weeks ago, and I did a commentary this last week on, okay, the largest corporation or the largest employer is Walmart. And again, there's sometimes criticism that they don't pay great wages, although I think they pay pretty well. But yeah, I think a lot of people in rural America say, I'm kind of glad we got Walmart. I got such a selection that I didn't have in this small town before at a very good price. The second one is Amazon, and everybody's saying, if you're going to tax Amazon, I buy things from Amazon. You're really, in a sense, going to tax me. And then same idea, there are people that are working for Amazon, as Dr. Merrill Matthews points out, that say, I never thought I would achieve the American dream. And yet I'm a blue-collar worker, and I'm making $15 an hour. I get stock options. I get instantaneous health care. And in a few years, or maybe even in the next few months, they're going to train me to do even a better job and get more money. And Amazon's not just doing that out of the charity. They're doing it because they recognize we need an engaged and educated workforce. And so I think a lot of people are going to go, I kind of like the corporation that you are really wanting to tax, and that's going to affect me, don't you think?
Yes. And I mean, if you just go to the issue of Medicare for all, for instance, a company is providing health insurance for you. 217 million people have health care, private health insurance. And companies are providing this. You may have some sort of a deductible, but if you really, quote unquote, do the math, you will find that something's got to give if we jettison that and the government pays for health care for everyone. Mm-hmm. As Sanders says, no deductibles, no co-pays. Well, somebody has to pay for it. Medicare, the word Medicare means it's limited reimbursement for doctors and hospitals. So how good will my care be? Will it be as good as what I have now, where a hospital is actually making a profit? And then one of the other lines that you hear is the health insurance industry and the medical care industry is sucking billions of dollars out of the system. Well, it's just they make a profit. The part of the profit goes back into the hospital and to paying doctors and to equipment and to developing to research and development. So that's a misnomer to say it's being sucked out of the system and going into someone's pocket to make them rich. So, there's so many lines out there that appeal to some people. And I can see perhaps one of the most liberal people getting the nomination because of that. But I don't think that they would ever have a prayer of winning the election then.
Well, and again, if they even pay attention to, let's just give credit to former Representative John Delaney out of Maryland, who kept saying, this is, fairy tale economics. I've talked to these hospitals, and if you were paid at the Medicaid and Medicare rate, what would happen? And they said, well, we just go out of business. And so when he keeps saying all that, even though a lot of people said, well, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren fended that off, there are just enough individuals that are part of the Democrat Party that are saying, you're going to take this off the edge. You're simply not going to win the general election. You'll be lucky if you win the primary with these kinds of extravagant promises. So when we come back, we'll go
That's
through
just a Republican talking point, Kirby.
Yeah. You got the line down, don't you? When we come back, we'll get into some more aspects of that. If you'd like to read it, the first article is by Scott Rasmussen on the extravagant candidate promises. We'll be back right after this.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, Penna Dexter with me today. It is our weekend edition, and the first article we're talking about, we'll probably come back to it a little bit later again, are the extravagant candidate promises. And since we were talking about Elizabeth Warren, he spends a fair amount of time talking about Elizabeth Warren, but reminding us, Penna, of the fact that even though she's making these statements, there aren't that many people that agree. And the example I'll use, and I'll let you read from the article since you've got them in front of you, is just a while back there was a survey that was done showing that most Democrat voters believe that climate change is a big issue and we need government to do something. But then when they went back and asked a follow-up question, how much would you be willing to spend in order to address the issue of climate change, the median answer was $1 a month, which is not even a Starbucks cup of coffee. I mean, so there are a lot of people say, yeah, this is a big issue. But then when asked to be sacrificing something, doesn't turn out quite the same way. And Scott Rasmussen gives us some statistics, so I'll let you kind of run through some of those of how many people really believe this. You know, sometimes it's easy to believe the rhetoric, but if you go back and do some of these more targeted surveys, how many voters out there really are in lockstep with some of the ideas of Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, or in just a few minutes we'll get into some of the back and forth between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. But what did we find, at least in terms of some of the surveys by Scott Rasmussen?
Yeah, Scott Rasmussen found out that only 18%, this is through his polling, he's famous for accurate polling, 18% of voters share Elizabeth Warren's enthusiasm for banning private health insurance companies, and only 26% think illegal immigrants should receive health care subsidies from the federal government. Fewer than 1 in 5 believe the threat of climate change necessitates giving the federal government sweeping new powers to control the economy. And then some others that I found on Medicare for All, it's supported by 64% of Democrats. And this goes to, are they making themselves unelectable by going so far to the left? 41% of the public supports Medicare for All right now. And that's before it's completely unpacked before the public. And then 27% support decriminalizing unauthorized border crossings. It's only 27%. That's a big issue. Immigration has become the top issue right now that people are concerned about. And when you heard these candidates debating, they all acted like decriminalizing crossing the border was like a given, that everybody should be for that. And then reparations. It's only about 25% support reparations for slavery. But that also, people, they almost talk about that. You almost have to ascribe to that to be a Democrat, it seemed like, in these debates.
Yes. And part of the problem is that when you ask these questions and people aren't well informed, I could ask a question right now. I was doing some research on CRISPR, which is a type of genetic engineering. How many people in the country, except a few scientists and geneticists, really even understand what it is? So when you ask a question, you're not going to get a very good answer. But that's kind of where Medicaid and Medicare for All is right now, because Medicare for All sounds good because people say, oh, I like Medicare. But as Dr. Merrill Matthews pointed out yesterday, and he certainly studied this better than anybody I've ever run into, it will actually get rid of Medicaid. And at one point, remember when Bernie Sanders...
So everybody will be on Medicare. There won't be a Medicaid either.
Yeah, just everybody's on Medicare, but it won't be Medicare, and it won't be that. But remember at one point when Bernie Sanders made some statement about, I wrote the blank bill. Okay, remember that? Mm-hmm. Well, the argument was that it wouldn't take away people's health care. Well, I've got in front of me here Section 107 in the bill, and this is a bill that was written by, well, probably not by Bernie Sanders, but by his staff, and it's signed off by Elizabeth Warren, Kirsten Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, and a few others. Anyway, Section 107, prohibition against duplicative coverage, and that it says it shall be unlawful for, 1, a private health insurer to sell health insurance coverage that duplicates the benefits provided under the Act, or 2, an employer to provide benefits for an employee, former employee, or dependents of an employee or former employee that duplicate the benefits provided under this Act. The straight reading of that says if you have Medicare for all, those private policies that you like won't be there. Remember the old phrase, if you like your policy, you can keep the policy? Well, this seems to say if you like your policy, you won't be able to keep your policy. And I think some people listening to this might say, I kind of like my policy. I think either my private policy that I have or the one that my company provides is really pretty good. And for you to say you're going to take it away so that I go into a government system, it gets kind of back to some of the comments being made by John Delaney and John Hickenlooper and a couple of others in that Tuesday night debate, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, those Republican talking points that they're making, they're often positions that the Democrats used to hold not that long ago. But on Medicare, it will cover everyone. So no one will be outside the system to pay for it. Like right now, people pay Medicare premiums, but that doesn't cover the full cost of Medicare. It's paid by the taxpayers. But now everybody will be in Medicare. Hospitals will be supported totally by Medicare. The patients will all be Medicare patients. So you won't have private health insured people paying the higher costs at the hospital right now because on Medicare, a lot of times the hospital's costs are not fully paid and it's subsidized by people that are paying the full pop.
Very true.
You won't have any of that dynamic.
Yeah.
So that's another reason to look at this. And, as I said earlier, Bernie Sanders says there will be no co-pays, no deductibles, and no premiums. And so because of that, you'll have people demanding more health care because they won't be paying anything. There won't be that cost factor to make a decision. Maybe I won't have that elective procedure.
Well, and again, there are some differences in terms of the models people talk about. In the United Kingdom, you can, in a sense, come out of the system. It's kind of like, as we used the example yesterday, public education. We pay for public education, but then if you want to educate your kids in homeschool or Christian school, you have to pay additionally. But what Bernie Sanders is calling for is one that looks more like, say, Canada, Cuba, and a few other places where you can't leave the system. Everybody's in the system, and then, as you said, they're going to want more, but in order to even come close to balancing the budget, now we get into Ezekiel Emanuel and some of the things that were first crafted in the Affordable Care Act, and that is to say we're just going to have to limit access to some of those kinds of surgeries, some of those kinds of operations, some of those kinds of procedures, because otherwise we'll break the bank. So there will be longer and longer waiting lines, right?
Yes, there will. I think about my daughter a few years ago was going to school in Rome for a semester, and she came down with a staph infection, and she was hospitalized a couple of times there. They could never get it under control. And when she came home, they put her on an antibiotic that wasn't on the formulary there. She actually had private insurance through the school that she went to. They said, buy this insurance. We're glad we did because she got better care than the public system. But still, they didn't have that particular strong antibiotic. And when she got home, that's when she got well because she was able to have that.
Let's talk about drugs for just a minute because Big Pharma took it in the neck pretty good here. And the argument is that you should be able to pay less for your drugs. And I recognize that there are some drugs that are just incredibly expensive. But again, if you recognize how long it takes to get a drug onto the market in terms of clinical trials and all those kinds of things, and then you only have a few years in which your patent can exist, and then it becomes a generic drug that anybody can use, that's one issue. But what I thought was interesting is even, and I underscore even, because oftentimes the voice of moderation is supposed to be the former vice president. But even Joe Biden was saying, under my system, we'll bring in the drug companies, we'll tell them how much to charge for these drugs, and they won't be able to increase the prices. And I'm thinking, and that will guarantee that no more drugs of any kind of creativity will be generated, because they will say there is no way that I can even come close to recouping the amount of time and effort and money that is required for research and development of a new drug.
Yeah, it's always been an issue, and I maybe there's a better way to do the system the way it is, because I know some people are hurt badly by high drug prices for drugs that they depend on for their very lives. I think the best way really is to find a way to help the people that really need it, not to revamp and redo the whole system, not to take the profit motive out from under the pharmaceutical companies. Because as you said, they won't have any incentive to invent new drugs and do the research. It's very, very expensive. Yes, there are people that need help, and we should always have some sort of a safety net. I'm enough of a compassionate conservative to say that, but certainly redoing a system to make it a government system, completely government system, it's the wrong way to go. It will reduce quality and increase costs.
We'll take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
Often, our most satisfying friendships are with like-minded people alongside whom we work for causes we care about. When the cause is love of and concern for our nation, and when the laborers are Christ followers, certain people rise up as treasured friends. They encourage you, lead you, teach you, and make you better and more effective. At the same time, they love you, and you love them. Debbie Terry was such a friend for me. She passed from this earth last month. As secular humanist philosophy began to replace the Christian influence, yes, even here in Texas, Debbie developed a fierce concern for the culture our children were going to grow up in, one that was hostile to the faith and principles we were teaching them. She plotted with other young moms who wondered, how do we make a difference? What do you do in a free country where you want to change laws that are ushering in immorality and squeezing out freedom? How do you act to rein in the drift from founding principles? You pray. Then you find candidates you hope will get it done and elect them. Debbie learned that the most effective and enduring way to organize those of a mind to join this effort was to establish a Republican Women's Club. Under her leadership, and because of the burgeoning threats to the culture that were becoming apparent back in the 90s, Golden Corridor Republican women quickly became the fastest-growing such group in Texas. I joined a year in. Through this club and projects that followed, Debbie empowered and helped to elevate countless godly leaders and activists. Here's what she modeled. To accomplish things in politics and the culture wars, you pray, plot, and work hard. Clearly persuade, boldly confront, but first, you love people, like-minded co-laborers as well as opponents. Get to know their hearts, help them make beneficial connections. They say Debbie was a fighter. I'd agree. A grace-filled warrior. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Penna Dexter with me. It is our weekend edition, and then, of course, we're going to be going on to our national program in about 15 minutes. But just before we do so, the second article we've posted here today, Penna, is by Mark Penn. And you might explain who he is, because this, I think, gives you some understanding of a little bit of the frustration that's coming from some of the leaders in the Democratic Party, some of the individuals that have been pollsters in the past.
Well, Mark Penn was an advisor to former President Clinton from 95 to 2000. Even during the impeachment time, he was. So he was, I mean, his name was a little bit more well-known then than it is now, but he's out there still writing. And he said by the end of the endless debate, spooned out in 1 minute dollops, I walked out with a $1,000 a month check an extra grand if I'm a female, untold reparations dollars if I'm African American, Medicare from birth covering everything I'll need until death, and the right to cross the border without any real penalty if I'm from another country. And I might add, you get an extra 1,000 in baby bonds for, you get an extra 1,000 a month if you're a female. Yeah, he said that.
Yeah.
And then baby bonds for every newborn baby of $1,000.
Well, and again, let's put this in perspective. First of all, $1,000 a month, that is Andrew Yang. And you might say, well, who is he? And a lot of people are going, who?
Yeah.
But at the moment, let me just say that there are 7 candidates that have qualified for the next debate, which is in September. And you have to actually have a certain percentage on 4 different polls, and you have to have a number of unique donors. I won't go into all the details. And essentially, Andrew Yang has already surpassed the level of donors, so as long as he gets some kind of attention, he and Julian Castro will also qualify. So you might end up with 9, but you go from 25 to 9 pretty quickly here.
One night instead of 2.
Yes. And so, but again, he's talked about the fact that, well, we just ought to start paying people because robots have taken over everything. And you get an extra $1,000 if you're female and all those kinds of things. And so it's you get $1, you get $1, you get $1,000, you get $1,000. And of course, the American people might be asking why, and does that make any sense? And will that be motivating for individuals and on and on? But I think what Mark Penn is getting at is, where is the aspirational part? I mean, there are people who have been very successful in the past, who sometimes have been really short on specifics, but very good on rhetoric. And I'm thinking about whether it's Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, whether it's more recently Barack Obama, even the campaign last time of Donald Trump, build a wall. And this time it's just kind of bits and pieces. And I think that's what Mark Penn is saying here, is that we're just dealing with a lot of minutia. And I think even the typical Democrat voter's eyes kind of glide over and say, who's going to really lead us? Who's going to really bring our message out? And who's going to be successful in defeating Donald Trump? And I think there is a sense of frustration that Mark Penn and all sorts of other people that have been interviewed this last week over the last 2 sets of debates. And so if something doesn't change in September, I think Donald Trump's going to say, I'm in pretty good shape here.
Yeah, well, by necessity, it will change because the rules are higher
True.
to get on the debate stage.
Yeah.
So that will happen. I think that, Donald Trump was successful, I think, partly because of the numbers of Republicans that were out there. And, the whole time he led the polls almost from the beginning
Yes.
of those debates. So that's probably not going to happen here. I think Joe Biden almost has to flame out because he's just he did a lot better this time, but he still shows himself to be not totally in command of all policy as much as I think you would want a president to be. I just sincerely doubt if he will stay the front runner the whole time. But, unless somebody can come up and rise and be very strong like Trump was, I think they are going to hurt themselves with the numbers that they have, because they really are running against each other and not. Yes, they're trying to run against Donald Trump, but they're really running against each other, and they're doing it with, as you said, minutia. They're doing it with things that, for instance, even though people in the know were kind of shocked and taken aback by Tulsi Gabbard and her recounting of some of Kamala Harris's cases that she prosecuted in California and people that she put in jail. And that hurt her among some people. But I would say most of the country wasn't paying attention, maybe doesn't even know she was Attorney General of California. Mm-hmm. And so, there's a lot of history in some of these debates that people they don't have a context for.
And again, you and I were just talking about the fact that sometimes a few activists can make a difference. We just talked about Debbie Terry. In the primaries, it isn't so much about numbers, it is about energy.
Yeah.
But when all of a sudden Tulsi Gabbard comes out of the woodwork and says there are just too many examples to cite, you put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations, then laughed about it, or then talks about you blocked evidence that would have freed an innocent man from death row until the courts forced you to do so. so you kept people in prison beyond their sentences to use them as cheap labor for the state of California. Some of the activists are going to say, I thought, Kamala Harris was my person, and I still think she has the best chance of anybody out there to win, because I think a lot of Democrat statuists have said, look, I don't want another white male debating a white male. And so that, by definition, eliminates a lot of those people on the stage.
She seems serious, too.
Yeah,
I think that people are looking at, somebody who's a serious candidate who...
African-American woman with legal experience, a senator running against a white male who can be easily labeled as a racist and that kind of stuff. That's what they're looking for. So, and it decides, as you and I know, we both grew up in California. Used to be we'd vote in the primaries in June, in which it made no difference. This time, California votes March 3rd. And so Super Tuesday includes California, Texas, and all sorts of other states. Then the second Super Tuesday is the 10th. I do believe that March 10th it's over. But we will see, because there's a lot of time between now and the general election, a lot of time between now and even Super Tuesday.
Going back to the Pander Fest that Mark Penn describes, I think one of the other the risks to the Democrat Party is the amount of promises they're making. Rent subsidies, paying off student loans completely, forgiving them, free college, at least free community college, but perhaps free college. All these jobs under the Green New Deal, for instance, and cleaning up the environment and changing the climate. I mean, they're making so many promises, and there's a contingent of the population that will be so excited about these things and perhaps nominate somebody that's making these promises. And that's why Kamala Harris, she buys into all the promises, but you can bet it's going to change if she's the nominee. She's going to have to then unexplain some of her positions. But, they do risk nominating somebody who's making some very, very unrealistic promises.
Well, again, those are a couple of articles that we've posted. The Mark Penn one I thought was most striking because, again, he is very supportive of the Democrats. You would expect Karl Rove to have a different set of ideas. And when we come back, I do want to spend just a little bit of time when we can to talk about who has endorsed Medicare for All, the Green New Deal, and reparations, because those were some significant issues. And it looks like virtually all the candidates are convinced that if you make it into this country, even if you're here illegally, you should have access to the healthcare system. And what does that mean in terms of some of the costs, too? So we have a lot more to cover. We will certainly do so. And so if you'd like to find some of the things that we've been quoting from so that you can read them for yourself, they're all available on our website, pointofview.net. Penna Dexter's commentary on the Viewpoints commentary today on Debbie Terry that we talked about is there as well. And we'll come back and begin to focus on a couple of issues, including some news about the number of people working and how that has become difficult for some of these Democrat challengers to tell us that this is a bad economy. Actually, some people think it's doing pretty well. We'll come back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our weekend edition. Penna Dexter with me. And, of course, on our weekend edition, we're going to be looking at a number of things that have taken place this week. We'll focus a fair amount of time and attention on the Democrat primaries, but we also have an article about Baltimore and a couple of other issues that we will certainly get into as well. But, Penna, sometimes when we have some of these economic numbers, I like to lead with that. And oftentimes when Kelly Shackelford is with us, although he couldn't be with us today, he likes us to talk about that. But here, this particular article, 157,288,000 employed in July. That was up 283,000 from what was employed in June. Unemployment rate held steady in July at 3.7%. Now, you can add to that some of the other things we've talked about before. Historic unemployment figures for African American, Hispanic American, record unemployment records for many decades for unemployment for women, median family income increasing, even adjusted for inflation, wages increasing. This is something that is going to make it a little more difficult for the Democratic candidates we're going to talk about in just a minute to actually run, because if indeed pocketbook issues are important, right now the economy is doing pretty well.
They are. And in the Washington Post, in reporting on hiring, and of course, it's a little bit slower than recent months, but companies are saying this is a golden age to get a job or to ask for better pay and benefits. And that's the other part of this is, for a while there were the jobs, but there wasn't the increases in salary and wages, and those are coming now too. So, it does amaze me as I look at the debates, and they all have to make the case for why we need these large programs. And so especially Elizabeth Warren, when she does it, she always talks about how the economy is not working for the average person. And yet these numbers and others, they refute that idea. And when you have to talk down the economy so much as they do in order to sell these big programs, I think it becomes a hard sell as people's lives are getting better.
We're going to talk about that in just a minute, but since we always like to open up the phones, I already have one phone call, but before we do so, let me set that up. And that is one of the things to pay attention to as you start looking at the primary season for the Democrats is that something remarkable has changed. And that is, we've always talked about Super Tuesday. Well, Super Tuesday takes place next year, March 3rd. There are a dozen states, as well as even Democrats overseas, that can actually vote on that day. And so, and one of the most significant is the state of California.
Which used to be at the end.
Yeah. I mean, you and I grew up in California, and we know we'd vote in June, and it really made no difference at all. Now, California, Texas, Tennessee, all sorts of other states are going to vote. Then you have Louisiana, a couple others pick up. By the time you get the next Tuesday, the kind of the second Super Tuesday, you will have almost 24 different states that will either have had a primary or a few will have a caucus. Now, one of those is Puerto Rico having a caucus, but our friends in North Dakota, Maine, Puerto Rico will have a caucus. The rest of them are votes. And so I think it's going to be over by then. And so the primary season is very different. And that's weighted maybe in favor of somebody that has name identification. Joe Biden. Somebody has a lot of money, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, somebody like that, or Kamala Harris. But also it helps you if you're a senator from California and pick up all those delegates. So I think
helps her.
You can see where that is the case. One of our callers wants to talk about some of those primaries. So Richard in Georgia, you have the opportunity to join us today here on Point of View.
How you guys doing?
Good. What would you like to add?
Well, first, God bless both of you. I listen as much as I can. I will start this conversation off as such. I hold no political party. Okay, I want to talk to the hypocrisy of politics, right? And you mentioned statistics and things of that nature, and let me reiterate the point that was previously presented. When Obama was in office, he tried to make the same suggestion that unemployment was at an all-time low. How did he do that? Well, disability increased 70%.
Yeah, they played with some of the numbers. That's true. And even the consumer price index, some of that, all of that's been kind of a little bit tinkered with. I'm with you.
Right. So my point here is that, whatever story that you want to tell, you can manipulate whatever metric or number or statistic that you want in order to get your point across. My point, and what I am heartbroken about, and I'll be honest, again, I am not a Democrat, I am not a Republican, but I believe in my lifetime, and this is going to be contrary to maybe your point of view, but just hear me out on it. I believe that Bernie Sanders was the best candidate that I would ever be able to vote for. And guess what? Not his party, supposedly, because he's not a Democrat, right? But the man that sits in the White House was a lifelong Democrat that couldn't carry the tri-state, so he ran as a Republican. So all that aside.
So I want to get to the bottom line because we're coming to a break, but I guess what you're saying is you like what Bernie Sanders put forward last time. Do you like what he's putting forward this time on the debate stage?
I like Bernie Sanders because to affect any kind of real change, you're going to have to stand up to big business. And that's exactly what he said. And the career that he's presented, I feel that he was going to be the man for the job. And the Democratic Party ousted him. You want to talk about the second Super Tuesday? The second Super Tuesday had him already losing.
Yeah, and again, we're coming to a break, but I think we got the point.
Yeah, a lot of people in the Democrat Party are mad because of that.
Oh,
they
sure.
see that Hillary's loss is because of
system
that.
was rigged against him. Now, I will be willing to at least defend the numbers. I mean, how many people have a job? That's you can't fiddle that one.
And if you look at your own life and it's good, that is going to affect your vote too.
Well, that's good. Okay, starting off with somebody that feels the burn. And when we come back, I want to talk about some of that because it relates to the first article we've posted today by Scott Rasmussen. Scott Rasmussen's been on the program with us before. He's done some various surveys. How many people, in his particular case, he mostly quotes from Elizabeth Warren, but some of these comments that he makes about these promises by Elizabeth Warren are almost identical to Bernie Sanders. On the Tuesday night debate, Penn, I got the sense that they were pretty much in lockstep. I couldn't find much distance between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, so that will fit. Of course, one of the other things I want to do is mention each one of these proposals. We'll look at Medicare for all. We'll look at the Green New Deal. We did talk about that briefly yesterday with Dr. Merrill Matthews. We'll look at reparations. We'll look at immigration, and we'll take on each one of those issues. And if you would like to join us, we've already started off with the phone call, so we'll take some more of those. 1-800-351-1212. You've watched the debates this week. You've seen some of the candidates. What about that? And what are your thoughts? We certainly want to encourage you to give us a call. 1-800-351-1212.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, for the last few decades, politicians and high-tech companies have been talking about the digital divide. They wanted to make sure that poor and underprivileged students have access to the same digital devices as wealthier ones. I've always felt that there was a bigger issue that fewer people were talking about. Fortunately, Naomi Schaefer Riley addresses this in her New York Times op-ed on America's Real Digital Divide. She warns that if you think middle-class children are being harmed by too much screen time, just consider how much greater the damage is to minority and disadvantaged kids who spend much more time in front of screens. One study, for example, found that minority children watch 50% more TV than their white peers. They use computers for up to 1.5 hours longer each day, and the amount of time Black and Hispanic children spend in front of any screen is substantially longer each day than for white children. Another study found that every additional hour of TV increased a child's odds of attention problems by about 10%. Kids who watched 3 hours a day were 30% more likely to have attention problems than those who watched none. The push from politicians and educators has been to bridge the digital divide and get computers and other technology into the classrooms. Apparently, minority students already have access to technology. One Pew Research report documents that African American teenagers are more likely to own a smartphone than any other group of teenagers in America. Put simply, the problem today is not a lack of technology in the schools, in the homes, in the hands of young people. The problem is too much technology. They're spending a significant number of hours each day in front of a TV screen, a video game screen, a computer screen, and a smartphone screen. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter here. It is our weekend edition. We really do welcome your phone calls. And just the other day, I was quoting from George Will, in which he was saying, you know, one of the questions that would have been good to ask Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, as we were just talking about, is 3 of the signature achievements under Barack Obama were, number 1, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, the Affordable Care Act, and Dodd-Frank. And he makes the point that, number 1, you oppose the ratification of that Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is gone anyway. You're advocating Medicare for all, which is implicitly saying that you think the Affordable Care Act was a failure. And since Elizabeth Warren and really Bernie Sanders are talking about the corruption of Wall Street banks and capitalism, you imply that Dodd-Frank was a failure. So does that mean the Obama presidency was a failure? Now, nobody asked that question. It wasn't necessary.
In a way, it was brought up, though.
And go into that.
Well, I think because Joe Biden talked about some of the accomplishments that he and Barack Obama made, and they all just pounced on him. And it turned into a criticize Obama fest, in a sense, which is so interesting because, number 1, he's the most popular political personality in the country.
Yes.
And he was the most liberal American president in American history. You know,
and now not liberal enough for some of them on the stage.
Not liberal enough for just about all of the folks on the stage there. So that, to me, was not smart at all. And, you know, I think they're gonna live to regret that one.
Well, and one of the comments is about going against business, and of course, Elizabeth Warren talks about corporations. And the other day, I spent some time hearing first from Dr. Merrill Matthews about the fact, there are a fair number of people that are working with companies and businesses and corporations they really like. And I wrote a piece where I mentioned that one of the largest employers is Walmart. Now, there's sometimes a criticism about the fact that they don't pay enough, but by and large, I know a lot of people in a lot of rural areas that say, I'm glad we have a Walmart because I have such a selection of things to purchase at such a good price. I kind of like Walmart. Or let's take the number 2 employer, Amazon. And a lot of people buy stuff from Amazon every single day. And at the same time, there are people working for Amazon that said, I never thought I would be able to achieve the American dream. And I'm working at $15 an hour. I'm getting stock options. I'm getting instantaneous medical benefits. And more importantly, they're actually, as I pointed out in the commentary, training a lot of individuals so that they can fly drones, so they can program computers. Because it's not just out of the charity of their heart. It's because they want to actually come up with a trained workforce for the future. So I recognize when you think of some corporations, tobacco companies, maybe pesticide companies, you think those are bad people. But most of the time when you say corporations, I think a lot of people say, I kind of like the business or corporation that I'm working for or that provides goods and services for me.
It's painting with an awfully broad brush. And, the other part of it is Wall Street is seen as a demon. And yet now working people, most of them actually are part of Wall Street because they've got some kind of a 401k or retirement plan. And so, to then use that, it's disingenuous in a sense. And I think the successful millennials, who's a big voting bloc now, who are now moving up in their jobs and in their companies, they're starting to see their 401ks grow. They're taking care of themselves. To look at that I think most of them are they try to be fairly honest about their critiques and their questions. And to look at that and to say all corporations are bad, it's just hard to make that case anymore.
We got some other phone calls. I want to get to one of those, but in just a minute, Penna, the first article we have here is by Scott Rasmussen. And, of course, he's done some polls, and he reminds us that even though there are a lot of people that say we like your ideas, when he really goes and asks them specific questions, help us understand how many voters, for example, really agree with some of the things that, say, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are promoting right now as the kind of the lead progressives in the party.
Yeah, well, the big, I think the probably the number one issue is Medicare for all, and only 18% of voters share Elizabeth Warren's enthusiasm for banning private health insurance companies. As we mentioned before, that's what Medicare for all does. Basically, you cannot offer insurance that duplicates what Medicare for all would offer. So, and then the second one is immigration, big issue. Only 26% of voters think that illegal immigrants should receive health care subsidies from the federal government. And, so really when you look at the population, those are not winning issues. Fewer than 1 in 5 believe the threat of climate change necessitates giving the federal government sweeping new powers to control the economy. It was interesting. A couple of weeks ago, the chief of staff for AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, said that the Green New Deal was not really about climate change. It was about the economy. Mm-hmm. And that was, a true statement that, we've been saying for decades, really. Anything that has to do with changing the economy because of the environment is really more about the economy than it is about the environment, because most of the fixes don't really accomplish much. So, and then going back to some of the other stats that weren't in that article, but actually, here's one more that Mr. Rasmussen gives. If Trump wins re-election, 61% of voters nationwide think it's likely that progressive activists will respond with violence.
Whoa, yeah. This is a fascinating article. It's the lead article at pointofview.net. You got just one or two others before I start taking some phone calls. By the way, the phones are lighting up today, which is a good thing, and we'll get a chance to hear from some of the people that want to join us in just a minute.
Yeah, Medicare for all. Democrats like it. 64% of Democrats support Medicare for all. Only 41% of the public. And I think, Medicare for all has not been completely delineated. I think if people understood that there won't be any other type of insurance
Right.
allowed,
Mhm.
and it would, then you'll have a degradation in the quality of care by design. It really has to be. That's probably going to decrease support, I think of it. And then another stat, only 27% support decriminalizing people who come over the border illegally.
Mhm.
There's no criminal, it's basically open borders.
Yeah.
About 25% say that they support reparations for slavery.
So again, those are a couple. And for people that say, wait a minute, you would be able to have a private insurance. No, I've got right in front of me here, Section 107, Prohibition Against Duplicative Coverage. Says it would be unlawful for a private health insurer to sell health insurance coverage that duplicates the benefits provided under the Act. Number 2, an employer that provides benefits for an employee, former employee, or the dependents of an employee or former employee that duplicate the benefits provided under the Act. So even though at one point, remember Bernie Sanders saying, I wrote the blank bill. First of all, I'm not sure he did. I'm probably a staffer did. But we know what's in the bill because it's been printed. And Dr. Merrill Matthews was on yesterday and has read that. He's also read the Green New Deal. We're going to get to that a little bit later. But let's take a phone call or two, just as some of you would like to join the conversation. So, Adam in California, what's your point of view?
Yes, I just wanted to make 3 points, and I'm not afraid to state the obvious now. When Trump first came on, he surrounded himself with an elite team of, Christian believers. That's the way I'm going to put it. The second point is he's exposing everything that he's even got away with the government and the economy, and he's proving the fact that he wants to be an honest president. I don't care who he was before as much as I care about him now, because he's proving the fact that he could be an honest, reliable, credible president. And the third point I want to make is that everything they're trying to throw on him as impeachment and insurance and to the left and all the things that they're bringing out, he's exposing them on all the things that they wasted time and money with. And I love that about him, because he's letting them even expose what Mueller did, by coming out and saying basically how I can't do it and you guys wanted me to do it and now you have to do it, and nobody is standing up for him. And they're even trying to say, how come we can't do nothing to him after he's president? They're even trying to get him when he leaves.
Well, you live in the state of California right now. Your governor just signed a law that would actually bar Donald Trump from the state primary ballot unless he discloses his tax return. So I'm hoping you in the state of California in the primary would be able to vote for him. But it looks like right now the state of California, at least the legislature and the governor, are trying to prevent you from even having a chance to vote for him.
And you know why? Because we rip off people more than any other state in America.
Well, Adam, I appreciate your phone call, but he made a point just in passing that we can come back to, but I'll just mention real quickly, there are just a lot of Christians in the Trump cabinet.
Yes, there are. And the other part is honest president. I mean, a lot of people wouldn't use that word to describe Donald Trump, but he's actually kept his campaign promises.
Well, we'll come back and cover some of the other points because he made some. And there's also an opportunity to take a few more phone calls, which we will do so right after these important messages.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our phone calls, join our conversation, again, you can give us a phone call, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, and we are in the midst of our weekend edition, have a lot more to cover. I'm going to, in just a few minutes, talk about who has sponsored Medicare for All and a little bit more about what that means. But Adam made a comment that I thought we might pick up on for just a minute. People that have looked at the Trump administration say, there do seem to be a number of Christians. There have been a number of pastors that have been encouraging, and maybe they know the highly visible individuals like a Mike Pence or a Ben Carson. But we know a lot of other individuals that are Christians that have been part of this cabinet as well.
Yeah, well, these are high-level people, too, the ones I can think of. I mean, Kellyanne Conway.
Good example, yeah.
She's a believer. So was Sarah Sanders.
Mm-hmm.
And also Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State's a vocal Christian. And Sam Brownback, who's the head of the Religious Liberty Commission.
Right.
And then, like, in Health and Human Services, there were many Christians nominated for HHS because, of course, there's a lot of issues that the Christian point of view has so much to bring to bear on that. For instance, Charmaine Yost went in. I think she may not be there anymore, but Shannon Royce, who was she headed a coalition for trying to preserve to get a marriage amendment, and she's worked for the Southern Baptists, and so she's there. And Ben Carson is another high-profile Christian. So he nominated. He brought in a lot of Christians surrounding him. The other part, and I just at the very end of the segment, I was talking about him being an honest president. I mean, that might not be the word that a lot of people would use for Trump as being a businessman, but when you look at him and what he's done as president, he has kept his promises, and he does in his tweets. He tells truths, in his own way, but he says things that are often very true. They have truth to them, and he says them in a certain way to make a certain impact. And they offend some people, but I think many of them do that by design to make a point.
Well, the point that even some of his enemies will say is, well, you got to say one thing about Donald Trump. You know where he stands. There's no question there. And one of the things that I wrote in an article that's coming out in our next Outlook is when they've done some of these interviews with people and say, why do you like Donald Trump? One topic and one issue that shows up time and time again is moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Now, let's be honest. I've said this before. I don't think it was in the top 10 of issues for Donald Trump. I'm not sure it was in the top 20. It wasn't something that he made a big deal about. People didn't vote for him because of that. But I think it resonates with so many people because back in 1996, we actually passed a piece of legislation that would recognize Jerusalem as the capital. And there was a plan that the current president, Bill Clinton, would move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He promised to do it and did not. Then George W. Bush promised to do it and did not. Barack Obama promised to do it and he did not. Donald Trump promised and he did it. And I think it just sort of hit people.
It's a shock to the system.
Even when he doesn't fulfill some of his promises because he hits an impasse or there's a judge that prevents him, there's still kind of a sense that he's still going to try to do that. And that has been so different because when we open up the phones, we always have people say, these politicians, you can't trust them. They have this idea that campaign promises, the old line used to be, campaign promises are like a pie crust meant to be broken. And all of a sudden you see a guy saying, no, this is what I said I'm going to do, and I'm going to go out and do it. And I've even seen people that dislike him on CNN say, you got to admit, he made that promise, and he actually tried to fulfill it.
Well, for instance, the wall. I mean, it was a big promise. And, we all know that even though he has not gotten Congress to agree with him, he's actually persisted and found ways to do it. Some ways, some people say, are unconstitutional or out of the box. But he's been dogged in his pursuit of some of these goals. So he's a disruptor. And, whether you like disruption or whether you don't like disruption, that is what he's done. And I think that will be his legacy. And I think there'll be some things that will be a lot better in this country because he has been president.
Let's take some more phone calls. We'll go to Ohio, WGGN, and Nathan. What would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, I want to thank you for all you guys do and the information you guys give us. But the first caller you had mentioned something with Bernie Sanders and how Bernie Sanders said someone needs to stand up to big businesses. And Donald Trump is one of the first presidents that I know of that did what we actually need is someone to stand up to big government. And the more power we give the government, the more of our rights are taken away, whether people choose to see that or not. more money, more rights. We didn't have an income tax until 1917 in this country, yet schools still functioned. We had police officers, we had fire stations, we had roads. So we keep feeding the government money when we as a people can stand on our own still. The more money and the more power we give them, the more things they take away from us. You need a license to hunt, a license to get married, a license to feed your family. You can't grow crops unless you have a certain I don't know what the word is, but you have to have like a certain thing from the government to say you can grow crops. We have to get permission to live our lives as Americans when we're the most free in the whole world.
You know, when I was first getting started, since I'm the old guy around the table, I had a secretary that actually remembered what it was like to live in a town where there was only a few people that had cars, where any time you wanted to communicate, you had to type on a typewriter. And she said at the time when she was growing up, the only contact she had with the federal government was the post office. It was just amazing. Now, there's not anything you can do, Nathan, any day of the week, almost any hour of the week, that doesn't, in one way or another, put you in contact with the federal government, some rule, some regulation, some law, or something like that. We obviously need regulations. We obviously need laws. But this president said, maybe we have entirely too many. And Penna, remember where the goal was to get rid of 2 regulations for every new one you implement? Last time I looked, that number was up to like 17 to 1 or something like that. And removing some of these regulations that aren't helpful, lowering the tax rates, maybe that's part of the reason why, as we started the program today, we start to see more and more people employed than ever before.
I think so. And, you know, Nathan, I really appreciate your call because I think, you know, you look at all the different proposals. For instance, we as conservatives have always been against the government taking over health care because it encompasses so much of life, so much of the economy, and just your person, your health, your well-being. You really want to put the government in control of that. You know, look at the DMV, look at the post office, look at how much red tape and struggles sometimes you have dealing with those. But what about other things? Student loans. When the more the government has been involved in funding education in the student loans, the more expensive education has gotten. So, you know, that's an area, and they want more of it. They now want to take over not only student loans, but also repay people's student loans. Then childcare. Elizabeth Warren has a proposal to take more federal role in childcare, really. Housing subsidies. We're hearing about that as a campaign promise. The government is not known for efficiency, and the government is known for wanting to increase its power. And I think that's what this election will be about. Republicans are going to need to make that point in each one of those areas where they're promising to make people's lives better. We have to ask the question, will that be the case, and how much will it cost?
You know, back to some of the topics we're going to address is Medicare for all. There's kind of a counterpoint between Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, in which he was saying this is going to cost $3 trillion. And the best answer she came back with is better to spend $3 trillion now. And again, these numbers come off of our head. $3 trillion is $3,000 billion. $3,000 billion. So if you can't get that in your head, this is huge. Well, better to spend $3 trillion now than $6 billion later on.
$6 trillion.
$6 trillion, $3 trillion, a trillion here, a trillion there. It's real money. And again, this is the plan put forward by Bernie Sanders and also co-sponsored by Cory Booker and Kristen Gillibrand and Kamala Harris. Oh, now they're saying hers isn't Medicare for all. Elizabeth
Well, we
Warren.
need to explain that because it really is just delayed a little bit.
Just a little bit. And when we come back from the break, we'll also talk about another one because you have the Green New Deal, which is sponsored by all those names I just mentioned, as well as Amy Klobuchar. So again, these are very expensive, very intrusive kinds of programs into our daily lives. And maybe we'll talk again about what the Green New Deal would cost the average household. And I think Nathan's got a good point, but we have to take a break even after that good point. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you're willing to join us today, feel free to give us a call. Perhaps you have some thoughts about the Green New Deal, Medicare for all. We'll get to reparations and immigration a little bit later. There's just a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after these messages.
Often, our most satisfying friendships are with like-minded people alongside whom we work for causes we care about. When the cause is love of and concern for our nation, and when the laborers are Christ followers, certain people rise up as treasured friends. They encourage you, lead you, teach you, and make you better and more effective. At the same time, they love you, and you love them. Debbie Terry was such a friend for me. She passed from this earth last month. As secular humanist philosophy began to replace the Christian influence, yes, even here in Texas, Debbie developed a fierce concern for the culture our children were going to grow up in, one that was hostile to the faith and principles we were teaching them. She plotted with other young moms who wondered, how do we make a difference? What do you do in a free country where you want to change laws that are ushering in immorality and squeezing out freedom? How do you act to rein in the drift from founding principles? You pray. Then you find candidates you hope will get it done and elect them. Debbie learned that the most effective and enduring way to organize those of a mind to join this effort was to establish a Republican Women's Club. Under her leadership, and because of the burgeoning threats to the culture that were becoming apparent back in the 90s, Golden Corridor Republican Women quickly became the fastest-growing such group in Texas. I joined a year in. Through this club and projects that followed, Debbie empowered and helped to elevate countless godly leaders and activists. Here's what she modeled. To accomplish things in politics and the culture wars, you pray, plot, and work hard. Clearly persuade, boldly confront, but first, you love people, like-minded co-laborers as well as opponents. Get to know their hearts, help them make beneficial connections. They say Debbie was a fighter. I'd agree. A grace-filled warrior. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Weekend edition, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter with me as we're talking about some of these issues. And this week was kind of interesting because you had a number of people like former Governor John Hickenlooper, also former Representative John Delaney, and maybe even we can mention Representative Tulsi Gabbard, that were raising questions about some of these proposals, but even the back and forth, interestingly enough, between Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. We'll get to that in just a minute. But part of that is, do you keep private health coverage or do you eliminate that? And the argument of Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or many others that are actually sponsors of Medicare for All is that 170 million Americans who have private health coverage right now, many of whom probably like their coverage, would lose it. And so the argument being made by those individuals I mentioned just a minute ago, and of course we can talk about some of the other individuals as well that were on the stage, Tim Ryan, Michael Bennett, and some of the others, is you just aren't not going to win by telling people that you're going to take something away. The response, as you well know, Penna, was, well, that's a Republican talking point.
Right.
How do we think this through?
Well, first of all, the Republican talking point is what the Democrats basically ran on in the last election. So Republican talking points are pretty far to the left, I think. But, in this whole Medicare for All debate where, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are talking about something that would completely replace private health insurance. You wouldn't be able to have private health insurance. And that is not going to be popular. And Kamala Harris was with them until she put her finger in the wind and realized that was not going to work. So she's changed her proposal, but it's really not that different because she says, no, you'll be able to have this, but we will put a public option out there. And then the way they're going to structure the system will be that those companies will find it so economically difficult to keep offering health insurance that down the road, a few years, you'll still have Medicare for all. And so she's moved, it's like a public option now, but and we saw this when Obamacare was passed. Obama dropped the public option because it wasn't popular, and he didn't think he could get Obamacare passed with it. But we knew that in the plan, the overall plan about socialized medicine, that was going to have to come back. It's coming back now.
Well, again, there are some that are suggesting maybe we'll have another option, and Mayor Pete, for example, Buttigieg will say, well, maybe we'll just have those two options and people will choose it. But for really this to work, and I'm not a supporter of Bernie Sanders, but let me take his point, at least to help you understand why he's making that, is you got to have everybody in the system. Mm-hmm. Because when people are outside the system, it doesn't work. Now, when everybody's in the system, it doesn't work either. Just ask the people in Canada and other places on long waiting lines or being told that they will not have access to certain drugs on the formulary or not have access to certain kinds of surgeries because they're too old or whatever. But anybody that says we really need to have this work is going to have everybody in the system. And that's what you have in Canada and other states and countries that have done that. And that's, of course, going to tell 170 million people that have private health insurance, you won't be able to have that anymore. And so the argument which was coming up, and let's give credit where credit is due, not only the CNN questioners, but also some of the candidates were raising very important questions as to whether or not you're going to win the general election when you tell millions of people they can't keep their health insurance.
When you talk to Canadians, some of them will say to you, I loved it because I could go in, I never had to pay a dime.
Sure.
And so that's very appealing to a lot of people, especially those who have had trouble, maybe some big medical bills they've had to pay outside of their network or whatever. But the taxes that have to be levied on people, there's no way that you can just tax the rich and offer the programs that are being
there you go
and this one, Medicare for All, is supposed to cost $32 trillion over
mm-hmm.
10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So this has to be a major tax increase for not only the rich and financial transaction taxes and wealth taxes and all of that. It's going to go all the way down to the middle class. I mean, down into the middle class, not just the upper middle class. So everybody will be paying more in taxes. You'll have less control, eventually less quality, and that's just the way the system will be. That's what we'd be voting for if you vote for these big candidates who are very far to the left.
And the point you're making is it would go down to them, but also indirectly it would, because, you heard both Tuesday night and Wednesday night, Amazon has paid no taxes. Okay, well, there's some reasons for it. When you're losing money, you don't have a profit. But okay, let's just assume that you figure out a way to tax Amazon. Most Americans are going, well, I buy stuff from Amazon. That means I'm going to get to pay for more. And when they say we're going to go after Wall Street, and a lot of people say, well, I've got a 401k, I've got an IRA. I guess I'm going to, so it's not just the direct taxes, but it's all the indirect ones as well. And back to the issue of Canada, just for a minute before we take another phone call. There are people that say, I love what was in Canada. If I had a stuffy nose or I broke an arm, I walked in and I walked out and didn't have to pay anything. That's what Bernie Sanders says. True. If you're healthy like you and I tend to be, but if you need, cancer, surgeries, you need coronary bypass, you need, then age and limitations are going to really affect you. And there are a lot of people that go into waiting lines and simply die because there just isn't enough to go around.
Yeah, or if you don't die waiting, you're suffering. And here we are very used to immediate gratification with regard to medical care. We don't have to wait very long for tests most of the time. If we do, we complain.
Yes.
So I think this is going to be something else. You know, I want to mention, I think one of the big questions right now that the Democrat Party needs to ask is, what kind of election is this? Is this an election where we have to attract swing voters in order to win? Or is this a base election where we can win with only our base?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they can't. They cannot win without swing voters. And so I don't think they're thinking about them right now. At least these candidates aren't. They're not appealing to swing voters because swing voters ask questions about how much things are going to cost. And they can be, further to the left. They can like more government benefits, but they usually want to know, how much is this going to cost me? How much is this going to change my way of life? I really don't want my way of life transformed too much.
Yes. And when we come back from the break, I'm going to talk about what the Green New Deal could cost a typical household. I'll give you a hint. The typical household probably would spend an additional $70,000. $73,000 Florida, $72,000 New Hampshire, $71,000 New Mexico, $72,000 Pennsylvania. Most would. In other words, you'd spend more than you make in income. And since later this month I'm going to be in Alaska, hate to tell our listeners in Alaska, your number is $100,000 more
per family.
Per family, and most people don't make $100,000, and certainly don't make an additional $100,000. And so we'll get into some of the details of that. And that's just not the way to win an election. If indeed you look at some of those states that Donald Trump won last time, maybe he won them by a very narrow margin, and he did. But do you see those swinging the other direction for some of these candidates? So we'll get into that. We've got some callers on the line. If you'll stick with us, we will take a break and come back and give you that opportunity. First article we've posted here today, which is entitled Campaign Promises. It's by Scott Rasmussen, Extravagant Candidate Promises. And then we also have one that we're going to get to a little bit later, which is by Mark Penn, one of those individuals that used to work with the Clinton administration. Democrats debate Panderfest. And then before it's all through, we have some comments about Baltimore. President just keeps making those. The other night in a rally in Ohio, he added a few other cities to that list, so we'll talk about that as well. All those are available on our website, pointofview.net. We'll take a break, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information. about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Weekend edition, Penna Dexter with me. And let's take another phone call. I know Cynthia in Texas been waiting quite a while. KSWP. And Cynthia, thank you for joining us today. What's your point of view?
Well, good afternoon. I have a concern. What law regulates the admission of Texas illegal children in the public school system here? Yeah. And another topic is, what happened to line item veto in the federal budget?
It's been ruled unconstitutional, hasn't it?
Yes, it has.
But yeah. I'm opposed to raising the cap on federal ceiling debt, and I have been, and I'm really surprised that they didn't hold to that promise.
I know. I mean, now it just basically spend as long as you want. So you've got some really good points. Let me take the second one real quickly, because it's fairly easy to deal with, and that is, there used to be an attempt to say that the president could have a line item veto. A previous Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. I am more ambivalent about whether or not this court would. The conservative argument against a line item veto is that Congress has been given the power, in particular the House of Representatives, the power of the purse. And when you would allow a president to actually use a line item veto, then you would give that individual almost legislative power. So that's kind of the conservative argument. The liberal argument would be, we don't want to give that to Donald Trump. So in some respects, it's kind of difficult to pursue, because a line item is allowed in any other state, and most states, almost all states, have to have a balanced budget. And one of the ways to get there is to certainly threaten a veto or a line item veto to force various states to live within their means. But, Penna, as you well and I know, the United States Congress has been acting as if there are no limits to the amount we can spend, because we can keep printing money. Now, they don't really print money anymore. They just add zeros, ones and zeros to digits. But nevertheless, we are in a situation now that Congress and the president, and in both parties right now, I'd say neither Donald Trump nor any of these candidates seem to be concerned about the national debt. And I'll hold this little booklet up, my most recent article on national debt and our most recent booklet on the subject of debt. We're concerned about it. We were concerned about it back in the 1980s when that was taking place. But unfortunately, very few on either side of the aisle seem to be concerned about the national debt, and we should be.
The government will borrow $1.3 trillion this fiscal year.
Yes.
That's double just 2 years ago. It doesn't seem like either party or this president are that concerned about the debt or the deficit. And, interest rates are still fairly low. So it doesn't affect the budget as much as it will if interest rates go up. And it's going to, the national debt, the interest on the national debt will be a huge factor. Debt will be a huge factor. And raising the debt ceiling continually. We've had battles over it, but they're not even fighting over it now.
Yeah, that's the case. Your question about school enrollment of the people that are here illegally, well, this is one of the things that you could resolve if you could actually have a set of laws that said if you're here illegally, you're going to be deported. Now, it's not like we aren't deporting individuals. As a matter of fact, one of the questions that was asked of Joe Biden was under the Obama administration, the first 2 years, they deported, I think I said 800,000 individuals. And for a while, Barack Obama was known as deporter-in-chief. As I shared yesterday, that's a little bit of a fiction. Again, kind of reminds us of some of the things Richard talked about in the first hour. It's a fiction because really, in order to make it look like people were being deported, to make the unions happy, anytime somebody was even met at the border and turned away, that was considered a deportation. I think, Penna, you and I would say a deportation is if somebody comes to this country, is here for a period of time, we catch them, ICE catches them in Immigration and Customs Enforcement and sends them back to the border. So those numbers were sort of artificially inflated to, if nothing else, make the unions feel better about the fact that we're not allowing so many people to come in. But that nevertheless is the case that there were still quite a number of individuals that were met at the border, turned away, deported. But until we get something that looks like a true immigration law to say that if these people are here illegally, we don't need to put them in the schools, we need to send them back to their home country. But until we resolve that, almost every state says, well, of course we have to enroll them. Otherwise, we just have a bunch of truants walking around.
Yeah, so they're in the public schools. I long for a time where we have a system where everything is done orderly. I do not have a problem with certain programs that allow immigrants in to come in as it's beneficial to the country and sometimes even for humanitarian reasons. But we have to know who's here, and we have to know how many we can take in. We have to have judges that can decide asylum cases, and we have to have enough of them. And then once there's certain statuses, perhaps not citizen, perhaps not voting rights, then yes, we will have to have some sort of health care for them and also education. But the way it's done now and the way the giant numbers are having to be dealt with and dumped into certain cities, it becomes very expensive. And that's another part of this is the numbers of people are overwhelmingly poor and consumers of public services. So, that has to be part of the calculation on how many people we let in.
All right. And again, what you said sounds like common sense, and some of it was even articulated by the former Vice President Joe Biden. And you saw the reaction from Cory Booker. That's racist. You're saying that you would allow somebody in that has a PhD, and the implication is Cory Booker will let anybody in, and preferably those individuals that are going to be more likely individuals that will vote for the next Democratic candidate to the presidency. So that's how the debate went the other night. But when we come back from the break, let's, if we can, maybe get into Mark Penn. Mark Penn, as Penna can explain, is somebody that's been involved in the Clinton administration and actually is quite a writer. Over the years, I've used some of his material when I've written about the baby boom generation or some of these political ideas. So even though sometimes politically I might disagree, I thought his analysis of the debates was kind of interesting simply because, of course, he would be more sympathetic to some of the ideas being presented there. But whether he was saying it or Scott Rasmussen was saying it, or, of course, one that I quoted just the other day from Karl Rove, they're all sort of saying some of the same things. And then we just want to come back to this idea of the Green New Deal. And I'll give you, again, the list of those candidates that have signed on to the Green New Deal. And if you're looking for some sticker shock, I'll give that to you as well, because we'll find out that that's pretty expensive indeed. So again, if you find yourself saying, I got to read some of this for myself. First of all, the first commentary that we have here, the first article is by Scott Rasmussen on some of these campaign promises. Second one by Mark Pence, who actually wrote this for The Hill, which is kind of the journal of record for Congress. And then we have one on Baltimore. Democrats Don't Care About Baltimore by Tucker Carlson. And then one by Cal Thomas, Smelling Rats in Baltimore. So we'll get into some of those issues as well. If you thought the president was going to lay off on those issues, you did not listen to some of the things he said last night in his rally in Ohio. We'll come back and talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, for the last few decades, politicians and high-tech companies have been talking about the digital divide. They wanted to make sure that poor and underprivileged students have access to the same digital devices as wealthier ones. I've always felt that there was a bigger issue that fewer people were talking about. Fortunately, Naomi Schaefer Riley addresses this in her New York Times op-ed on America's Real Digital Divide. She warns that if you think middle-class children are being harmed by too much screen time, just consider how much greater the damage is to minority and disadvantaged kids who spend much more time in front of screens. One study, for example, found that minority children watch 50% more TV than their white peers. They use computers for up to 1.5 hours longer each day, and the amount of time Black and Hispanic children spend in front of any screen is substantially longer each day than for white children. Another study found that every additional hour of TV increased a child's odds of attention problems by about 10%. Kids who watched 3 hours a day were 30% more likely to have attention problems than those who watched none. The push from politicians and educators has been to bridge the digital divide and get computers and other technology into the classrooms. Apparently, minority students already have access to technology. One Pew Research report documents that African American teenagers are more likely to own a smartphone than any other group of teenagers in America. Put simply, the problem today is not a lack of technology in the schools, in the homes, in the hands of young people. The problem is too much technology. They're spending a significant number of hours each day in front of a TV screen, a video game screen, a computer screen, and a smartphone screen. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter with me, and it is Weekend Edition. And boy, we had a lot of comments being made. And the second article, Penna, that we've posted here is by Mark Penn. You might explain who he is. And that quote, especially in the second paragraph, I think sums it up very well.
Yes, well, it was a pander fest, or some people call it a slugfest, and that's not good for the candidates, because some of the lesser supported candidates were bringing up ideas that then the candidates with more support had to swing the club back at, and so you just wonder how beat up people are going to get. But by the end of this endless debate, this is Mark Penn. He was in the Clinton administration. He was a campaign guy, and so he's watched politics for a long time. He said by the end of the debate, which was spooned out in 1 minute dollops, and they were short, I walked out with a $1,000 a month check, an extra $1,000 if I'm a female, reparations if I'm an African American, Medicare from birth covering everything you'll need until death, and the right to cross the border without any real penalty if I'm from another country. That's everything that you get and more. If you listen to all these promises. And, of course, this was one that surprised me, Kerby, and that was a prosecution of criminals. You know, we had decades when we were tough on crime.
Right.
And now it's a Republican talking point to be tough on crime. They're wanting to open up. And, you know, in some senses, there are reasons for that. But this is going to make us less safe. And then there's another also big move to decriminalize marijuana, which, you know, you need to ask the people from Colorado how that's working out for them. But this was a panderfest for many, many liberal interest groups, and you heard it all up there.
And again, people might say, I don't know what you mean by $1,000 a month check or $2,000 a month of a
well, that's
female.
one candidate's pander.
Yeah, and that's Andrew Yang. And in just a minute, we're going to talk about the Green New Deal, because he also said in the debate, we're too late. We're 10 years too late. We need to do everything we can to start moving the climate in the right direction, but we also need to start moving our people to higher ground. Again,
if we're too late, why are they running on it?
Governor Jay Inslee has made that his foundational issue. And for many of the other candidates, they all talk about climate change. But let's, if we can, for just a minute before we take our next phone call, talk about what the Green New Deal might mean. And the Green New Deal, interestingly enough, is something that has attracted a lot of candidates. You have sponsors like Cory Booker, Bernie Sanders, Kirsten Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar. I think that's a pretty good list there of these that have actually co-sponsored the Green New Deal. Now, we've had Dr. Merrill Matthews on even as recently as yesterday, and he's actually read through all of the legislation for the Green New Deal, and first of all tells us that it has a lot more to do with socialism than it does with environmentalism. And I've got a commentary coming out next week from somebody that went to one of these socialist conferences in which that is the case. But back to one of the things that the Competitive Enterprise Institute found is that if indeed you get rid of coal immediately, and you want to completely get rid of oil and natural gas in 10 years, and you start running the numbers, first of all, to decarbonize this economy is going to cost the average household more than they make annually. And more importantly, you would have the kind of disruption that would just be horrendous. Dr. Merrill Matthews just talked about just if you were to try to replace some of the coal-fired plants with just various wind turbines, how many hundreds of thousands of those that have to be all over the United States, assuming that you could even store that power and use it when you actually need it. So the best way to still run an economy is on some of these very energy-rich items, which are called fossil fuels. But the fossil fuel industry was criticized almost as much as Big Pharma, Wall Street, as well as the health insurance companies as well.
In this country, we have done more to clean up the environment than other countries, and we aren't even part of for instance, the Paris Agreement. Because if you're a prosperous nation, then you can afford to do the things that help to begin to clean up the environment. When it's imposed upon you from on high, it's a recipe for, number one, utilizing these technologies that, yes, they might be cleaner like wind and solar, but unreliable. We have to get to the point where they're more reliable and more affordable. And, the government has been subsidizing these and will have to continue to for a good long time. So that's and if they don't, then it becomes very expensive for the consumer, as you've mentioned from these statistics that you have. So, for the government to require so many things in so many areas, for instance, they want to require eliminating greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. They want to require making all buildings energy efficient completely within 10 years. I mean, each one of these things is desirable in a sense, but it costs money. And then you have to make the calculation, well, if you're worried about the planet warming, if you're worried about certain damage to the environment, how much is what you're prescribing really going to help that?
That is the key issue.
And that's key.
Yeah.
That's really key, because a lot of it is something that's being done. It's almost like virtue signaling. It's doing these things to just make you look like you're a good liberal. Now, I look at the state of California, which I grew up there, and the smog was horrible, and it's much better now. And some of it does have to do with regulations that the government has placed on the economy and emissions and things. But some of it also has to do with companies just developing things and realizing it's in their best interest to do things in a cleaner manner. So it just it has happened in this country somewhat more naturally. I think government has a role, but this Green New Deal it's more of an economy changer than it is an environment changer.
Well, I think so. And I mentioned this commentary I've got coming out next week. It's based upon Jarrett Stepman. You've seen some of his articles before.
Daily Signal.
And he went to Socialism 2019 and the conference, which, by the way, had the tagline, no borders, no bosses, no binaries. And they even changed the signs in the bathroom because they didn't want to have gender binary and all that. But back to the point you're making, one of the most significant points was these particular individuals were actually tying socialism to radical environmentalism. Now, I'm not saying that all environmentalists are socialists. I'm not saying all environmentalists are communists. But I am saying that those people that are really serious about this make a connection because they recognize that the only way that this green movement, and in particular the Green New Deal, can be implemented is for a command and control economy. That's the Soviet Union, because you can't allow too much freedom. You can't allow too many people to do their own thing, because if indeed you are convinced that this is the existential threat to America, then you can't allow people to just go off like a herd of cats doing their own thing. You've got to move people in the right direction. So I recognize that not everybody that supports the Green New Deal is a socialist. Not everybody that supports the Green New Deal is accepting Marxist ideas. But these are individuals that understand that if indeed we're going to get serious about the Green New Deal, we have to constrain freedom dramatically, and government's got to step in ways that we would never probably have allowed in the past. But it's up for some grabs as to whether or not this younger generation would allow that to take place.
You know, I like one scientist, Bjorn Lomborg, because he takes all the proposals for improving the environment and he puts a cost on them. How much is it going to cost? And then he compares it with other things that you could spend government money on or that you could spend private money on. And then you make comparisons for each of those things. And no, you may not get all the provisions of a Green New Deal implemented, but you'll get some things because you'll make decisions based on cost and benefit. And, you know, that's not what this does. And the reason it doesn't do it is because there is, not for everyone that's involved in it, but for sort of the bottom line planners of this, it's really got a different agenda. It's called control.
That's right.
Controlling the economy.
Well, we're going to take a break, and let me just hold it up for those of you that maybe are watching online right now. This is my new booklet. Came out just about a month or two ago on climate change, and it has the Bjorn Lomborg material in there, even references one of his books. So if you say, well, okay, I hear what Penna's saying, but I'd like to read it for myself. That's why we have that little booklet. And matter of fact, recently was talking to somebody that was at the camp where I was, and he's in the mining industry. And he said, what about this idea of climate change? And I said, here, read this. And he really thought that was pretty helpful. So let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our teams stand strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute. And if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151. Or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, Penna Dexter with me. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. It is weekend edition. One caller couldn't stay on the line, but wanted to know if people who assaulted the man wearing a pro-Trump hat had been prosecuted. The first thing I always see whenever it's a claim on either side, remember Jesse Smollett, people say I was attacked because I was black or I was attacked because of a MAGA hat. You always want to make sure, first of all, it's not a false claim, but we'll follow that story. And I might just mention that one story that we do know about that is relevant, and it's in my stack here, but I'll pull it out real quickly, is you might remember that reporter up there in Portland who was assaulted, and no charges have been brought against anyone yet. A federal investigation into Antifa attack on journalist isn't justified. It's needed. And that's, of course, Andy No,
right,
who was beat up. And
he
so
has
far,
a brain bleed from it.
Yes, and so he's bleeding. They stole his camera equipment and all sorts of stuff. So that one is a good illustration that sometimes you can attack a conservative, you can attack a Christian, you can attack a reporter whose stories you don't like, and sometimes you can do it with impunity. And so far, that's what's happened in Portland, Oregon.
Yeah. And I mean, that's, I mentioned this earlier about how I was just so surprised about any kind of tough on crime policies that we've had in our country. And we have, and we've implemented many, and maybe we've gone too far in incarcerating people that have done minor drug or white collar crime. But still, to have that then undone, and just to kind of change the whole attitude now about our police and what they're able to do to keep order it's not a recipe for a well-run, healthy country.
No, it isn't.
Or city.
I've jokingly said, and I don't want to be taking too much light of it, but it's amazing that the crime statistics go up when we decriminalize so many things.
Amazing.
I mean, there are just so many things that aren't considered crimes anymore, and we still have problems with crime. And, of course, we see some of these lawless cities and places where that is the case. We're broadcasting today from the Dallas area, and there's a place in the South Dallas area where, in order to address crime, they sent in more police officers, and now you have somebody in city council there saying, we don't want police officers there because it makes some of the various individuals, some of the citizens feel uncomfortable. No, the goal is to make the criminals feel uncomfortable.
Which will make the citizens more comfortable.
I just don't know. I mean, there is a sense right now, and of course we've talked about this before, where the situation that was in Arizona where these police officers were asked to leave Starbucks, and we encouraged people to send their note to Starbucks because at first there was a concern that was the official policy of Starbucks. They, I think, rightly came out and said, no, this is not our policy, and we're going to try to change some of that. But there is still this idea that those in law enforcement are our enemies. I hope that most of you realize that they are your friends, and there are bad cops in every police force somewhere along the line have made some mistakes. But right now, this sort of we need to make sure that we decriminalize all sorts of acts that were before considered criminal is at least a discussion I'd like to have in an open forum, rather than just have somebody call you a racist or whatever, simply because you say that we've got crime in that particular community, which, of course, sets us up for Baltimore. Now, the back and forth between the president and Representative Elijah Cummings, we can set that maybe aside for the moment, just to recognize that when the president refers to this particular locale, and that's Baltimore, and we have listeners out there in that area, I think if you've ever been to Baltimore, especially downtown, you recognize that there are some real problems. And just the other day when they had this one television shot talking about what was happening in Baltimore, the reporter scanned over, and there's a rat ran right across the picture. So this was the case. And when your mayor, Catherine Pugh, just a year ago said that you could smell rotting rats, and then when you have Cal Thomas in his piece, Smelling Rats in Baltimore, this is not a racist comment. This is a comment that is just an assumption and an accurate assumption and observation about some of the problems in our inner cities here today.
Yeah, I mean, the president said it's a disgusting and rat and rodent-infested place. He said it's a corrupt mess. He said no human being would want to live there. And, those comments are not racist. If you try to construe them to being racist, you're being oversensitive. This city and many big cities across the country, which now the discussion is expanding to what's happening in our cities. But anytime the president challenges the status quo, and in Maryland, in Baltimore, it has been the status quo of very, very liberal governance and programs that just haven't worked to improve the situation. But when the president does challenge the status quo in these urban settings, he's always labeled as racist or prejudiced. And, Family Research Council made a great point about this. The problem isn't the presence of rats. I mean, that is a problem. It's the lack of fathers.
Yes.
And the sad part of it is this just the dysfunctionality of many of the communities. And it's, it's really, really a tragedy. It's a national tragedy.
And again, we're not going to endorse everything that Donald Trump said.
No.
But again, this article, it's the third article we've posted. It's written by Tucker Carlson and Neil Patel, pointing out that, as you've pointed out, 2/3 of those children growing up in single-parent homes, 22% of the city lives in poverty. But they made a good point. One of the big criticisms of Donald Trump has been the argument that if you're going to seek asylum, you can seek asylum long before you get to the United States. And one of those, quote, safe countries is Guatemala. Well, the left just went after him saying, well, Guatemala's not a safe location. But here, look at this number that Tucker Carlson brings out. The Baltimore rate for murder rate is double that of Guatemala. I mean, twice as many people killed by percentage or per 100,000 than in Guatemala. So if you're saying that Guatemala is not a safe location, you've already told me what you think literally about Baltimore. And again, this president never lets anything lie. Last night, he took on Chicago, especially San Francisco. And I don't think he's going to stop anytime soon. But maybe we don't like the way he sometimes in an inarticulate way says this. But this is a crime that people live in crime-infested situations. For the next generation, you have individuals who are growing up in single-parent homes, which is oftentimes a guarantee of some kind of difficulty later on. Ben Carson is the outstanding exception because he had a single mom. But if you look at the schools, this is interesting because, again, Tucker Carlson says 1/3 of Baltimore's high school students, 1/3 of the high school schools, I should say, had 0 students proficient in math. Well, in this world,
something's not working.
Yeah, if you want to be successful, you better know a little bit about math. You better know a little bit about computers. You better know how to read and write. And if you're going to go through school, and hopefully some of these students will graduate, although most of them graduate with a diploma that they're having difficulty reading perhaps sometimes. But if they do, they're not going to be successful in college and they're not going to be successful in life. So, let's recognize that we've got a crisis at the border, but we have a crisis in some of these cities. So even if I don't like kind of the ways Donald Trump brings these issues up, it's still an important talking point, and I'd love to get some comments from some of you. 1-800-351-1212.
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but, he's set up sort of a fight with the congressman, Elijah Cummings. How long has he been a member of Congress and represented just this dysfunctional area of Baltimore?
And I think it's unfair to criticize somebody that's just come into power and say, if you were to ask Van Taylor or Dan Crenshaw or even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who are first-term Congress people, what is happening in their district, that'd be unfair. But back to your point, Elijah Cummings has been there for decades, and he himself used to talk about some of the problems in Baltimore and point out, as a matter of fact, this famous clip that's been used all week is just 40 miles away from where we are right now, we have all sorts of difficulties, and I'm kind of paraphrasing what he said because he used a little stronger language. So it's not controversial, and it shouldn't be controversial to say that we've got some major issues that need to be addressed in the cities. And I just want to give a shout out to Scott Turner, who is one of the new individuals that's in the Trump administration to address this issue. And a shout out also to Ben Carson, who is the Secretary of HUD, who the other day actually scheduled a time to go through Baltimore, and somehow Elijah Cummings just couldn't show up. And as gracious as Ben Carson is, I know Elijah Cummings wasn't going to come, but Ben Carson, he's such a gracious person. He said probably there was a scheduling problem. I think we know better, but
he's
nevertheless,
been a member of Congress from that area for 36 years.
36 years. I thought it was almost 4 decades. Yeah. Okay, we got some phone calls. We'll take those right after these important messages.
Often, our most satisfying friendships are with like-minded people alongside whom we work for causes we care about. When the cause is love of and concern for our nation, and when the laborers are Christ followers, certain people rise up as treasured friends. They encourage you, lead you, teach you, and make you better and more effective. At the same time, they love you, and you love them. Debbie Terry was such a friend for me. She passed from this earth last month. As secular humanist philosophy began to replace the Christian influence, yes, even here in Texas, Debbie developed a fierce concern for the culture our children were going to grow up in, one that was hostile to the faith and principles we were teaching them. She plotted with other young moms who wondered, how do we make a difference? What do you do in a free country where you want to change laws that are ushering in immorality and squeezing out freedom? How do you act to rein in the drift from founding principles? You pray. Then you find candidates you hope will get it done and elect them. Debbie learned that the most effective and enduring way to organize those of a mind to join this effort was to establish a Republican Women's Club. Under her leadership, and because of the burgeoning threats to the culture that were becoming apparent back in the 90s, Golden Corridor Republican Women quickly became the fastest-growing such group in Texas. I joined a year in. Through this club and projects that followed, Debbie empowered and helped to elevate countless godly leaders and activists. Here's what she modeled. To accomplish things in politics and the culture wars, you pray, plot, and work hard. Clearly persuade, boldly confront, but first, you love people, like-minded co-laborers as well as opponents. Get to know their hearts, help them make beneficial connections. They say Debbie was a fighter. I'd agree. A grace-filled warrior. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and if you don't have a chance to join us today, feel free to give us a call next week. Just as a program note, we have Doug Groteis with us on Monday. We're going to talk about the generation that knows not Schaefer. We're going to talk about Francis Schaefer a little bit, but then we also have Alex Kendrick in a new movie, which, of course, the Kendrick brothers have produced things like A War Room, and this new one is going to be really fun. Michael Yosef will be with us, Sammy Rodriguez. Just an incredible week coming up. But Penna, I thought for just a minute before we get back to some of the things we've been discussing, your Viewpoints commentary today is about Debbie Terry. And I just think it's such a great tribute to somebody who I first met right here at Point of View. Marlon Maddox had gathered together a number of political activists, and that's where I met her. And you, of course, have owed a debt of gratitude to this activist, and that's just a good illustration of why we, as Christians, really need to get involved with other fellow Christians and make a difference in our communities and our world.
Yes, Debbie modeled not only friendship and was a good friend to me that I valued, and I'm going to miss her, but she modeled to me how to make a difference and do it as a believer. Because, we sometimes get criticized for being involved or being too political as Christians, or thinking this is a quote-unquote Christian nation and conflating politics and religion. But Debbie did it. She made a difference in the culture in a beautiful way because she loved people. She also was very convincing, so she could get you to help her out on her project just by talking to you for a while. But that love piece of it was the most important part. And even her enemies, she considered who the person was. She found out about them, and then she would connect people that she thought should connect. And some of the connections she made were state changing. She worked hard in the state of Texas to make a difference, and she did. She started the Golden Corridor Republican Women. And again, this was a group of women who loved each other, but it became the fastest growing Republican Women's Club in Texas and elected a lot of great people here. As Texas became more and more conservative, this was a great part of it. So this woman, Debbie Terry, who went to be with the Lord and was honored at a wonderful service the week before last, or maybe it was just last week, I guess it was.
Yes, hard to believe.
She modeled, I think, the best way to make a difference. And, as you mentioned always, Kerby, you say it's not a me problem, it's an us problem. And, of course, we have to band together to get things done, whether it's in politics or just on the issues that we care about. And Debbie started organizations. She also helped a new group that's come up in the last few years, which is it's a prayer caucus. We've got the presidential prayer caucus, the congressional prayer caucus. Now we have a legislative prayer caucus,
That's
which
so
Debbie was part of that, and she wants to see that. She wanted in her final days to make sure people got involved in that. But I think I took that because sometimes we get so passionate about our beliefs and where we want to go in politics, who we want to elect, and we forget about that love factor, and it's really more powerful than anything else. So Debbie's with her Lord now, and we'll see her again, which gives me a lot of great comfort. But she leaves a legacy of how to do the culture wars and how to do politics in a way that honors the Lord.
Well, again, that is on our website. And if you have not signed up to get the Viewpoints commentaries, when you sign up, you get mine Monday through Friday and Penna's on Saturday. Or, of course, you can go to pointofview.net and read that. And I think it's just the power of one, the kinds of organizations she started and the kind of impact she had, and then the value of joining together with others to make a difference. So very powerful. One of the things I thought I might just mention real quickly is the need for us to make sure that our perceptions are accurate, because one of my commentaries next week comes from Arthur Brooks. We've interviewed him before, and he wrote a piece recently in which he said there was a study in the Journal of Politics in which they found that the average Democrat believes that 40% of Republicans earn more than $250,000 a year. What? Now, that's probably one of the reasons why they think, we can afford it because these Republicans are so rich. By and large, there are very, very few. 2% of Republicans fit into that category, not 40%. Now, on the other side, he also, to be fair, said that sometimes Republicans think that a lot of Democrats are LGBTQ, and that's about 6% at best. So that's not the case either. But the ones that we found, especially when we interviewed Jonathan Haidt, we interviewed him on the book of The Coddling of the American Mind. And he's not a Christian, but his co-author was. But he wrote a book a while back on the righteous mind, in which he asked liberals, moderates, and conservatives to try to pretend to be someone else. Answer this survey, if you're a liberal, how you think a conservative would answer it. And then if you're conservative, answer the survey the way you think a liberal would answer it, and then answer it the way you would answer it. And what he found, Penna, was striking, because indeed what he found was that moderates and conservatives were very accurate in their predictions, in part because conservatives hear liberal media every day, and so they get to understand that. But the liberals were the least accurate, especially those who describe themselves as very liberal. Which brings me back to Arthur Brooks, because he pointed out that there is a perception gap between Democrats and Republicans, but it's the worst for the most extreme. If you're a liberal progressive, you just don't even live in the same world. And interestingly enough, oftentimes they're the ones driving the debate. He argued that only 22% of U.S. adults are on Twitter, and 80% of those tweets come from 10% of the users. So basically, if you're just reading Twitter, you're being informed by 2.2% of the population. And in some cases, those are the most extreme, and they're the ones that are probably misperceiving the rest of the world.
So conservative Christians are sort of an alien sector of the society to them. And I think it's really interesting if you go to certain parts of the country.
Sure.
Because like in the South, I think people understand the liberal mind because of the media, as you said. And many people are more conservative in the South. But in the Northeast and other parts, even the Northwest, people don't even...
They don't encounter it.
No, they don't encounter it. So you can almost say, we need to educate you on who we are, that we're real people, and that we have, real reasons for the things we believe.
Yes. And again, I spend time every year in Oregon and Vermont, and those are the two most secular states in terms of by percentage and numbers. Fewer people go to church in those states than any other states. And I'll tell you, there's just a complete misperception there. You go to downtown New York City and you talk to anybody about somebody that lives in Kansas and Nebraska. I mean, they don't even understand what it's like. They don't even understand what it's like. And they live in what are called bubble zones. They ask questions. Have you ever been to a Walmart? Have you ever driven a pickup truck? And they're just, all of them go, no, 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 no. They've never even lived in that experience and don't even understand it. So part of the problem we have right now in politics is the misperception. So anyway, next week I've got some commentaries coming out on that. And a lot of that comes from the good work by Arthur Brooks. But let me again say thank you for covering the show on Monday. Thank you for covering when I was out of town for a little while. And we're back in town and looking forward to a great series of programs next week. And, Michael Yosef would do pretty well with that, and you also were going to spend some time with a couple of the other guests that we have, so that will be great. But one last time, let's just mention that we have a couple of articles available to you today, one on campaign promises, one on the debates were kind of a panderfest, and then just some of the material and facts and figures we gave you on Baltimore, and I hope that will be helpful to you. Penna Dexter's commentary is available to you, and if you haven't signed up to receive that, I would encourage you to do so. We have an opportunity for you to email AT&T about HBO series Euphoria. That's still on the website. And most importantly, if you would like to listen to anything we've talked about this today or this week, you can download that on your podcast. We have it for you to listen to or even to watch on the YouTube channel. But I hope you have a great weekend. I want to thank Andrew. Glad to have him back. And Steve, have a great weekend. We'll see you back here on Monday right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.